Hello, welcome everyone. Today we will talk about challenges of cloud migrations. My name is Riju and I'm a cloud solution architect working with enterprises to help them move their applications into the cloud. And in this, I'm going to talk about the legacy application which runs today on premises. How do you plan and what really needed to move them into cloud? That could be any cloud, not just one cloud, but any cloud. So we'll see how these things are really taught and practiced in reality, and then we will see step by step what all things we need to do to take care of those challenges. Now here I want to show a picture of Piet Mondorian. Piet was a Dutch painter back in early 1900s. And when in the Haarlem school there used to be landscape painting. And you all might know that Dutch landscape painting is something which is appreciated across the globe. They are the best of the best. And what Pete really did, it did not follow what the trend back then. That means painting the landscape in two-third versus one-third kind of thing, where two-third will be the Dutch sky with nice cloud, which is only available during few months of the summer, and the windmill and the waterways, the dikes, the lakes, etc. And there are many such paintings, if you just recall, most of them, if you like, are Dutch landscape paintings. So Mondarian comes from that age. So he lived through that age and he got trained by the Harlem School back in his early career. But he did not really follow what the trend was. What he did, he picked up his own style because for a brief moment, he came to Paris from Netherlands and he got influenced by then Picasso and Baroque, who are the the Cubist painters back then, trying to do abstract cubism, right? And he got very influenced by them. And there are paintings by Pete, which clearly shows that kind of influence. But he really what he really went from that his training of the super perfect pictorial Dutch landscape to the cubism to this is that he took a very simplistic approach of lines and squares and rectangles. And then he used, if you notice that most of his later painting, he used only the basic color, right? So only the basic colors, no mix of colors, right? Mostly the lines are drawn in black. And what Pitt really did is an amazing thing, right? Back then it was not accepted, as you can imagine, but he influenced a lot, starting from Nike to the designer to the building, the architecture, the glass ceilings, etc. Pete really is everywhere because he influenced the whole society and whole community as such by his dramatic way of thinking how painting could look like, right? So that's what I wanted to talk about today. That you may have certain trend, what works today, what doesn't work today, that thing, but beyond that, there are many things you can bring in. And as an architect, you must have that ability to break the barrier and bring in something which is never thought about, right? And this painting is back from 1937. So you can imagine like it's so modern, even if it is relevant today. And a lot of people love this painting, right? So now, just before jumping into that, for any migration is a money because there'll be people involved. That's a mandate. You are getting paid by the day and hours. There are resources being used by the company. So you will be basically so in a typical enterprise kind of scenario, you need to have a strategy to move to cloud, which means that you need to have the business buy-in. You need to have the company focus while thinking about moving into cloud, you need to have an approval for the money, because that's the spend you need to add at the end of the day, because you are moving and workload, and moving and workload is not like moving a box. So it requires a lot of process and things like that to take care, and then you need to go through a whole lot of testing process. So it is a lot of activity. It's not just simple thing, just not switching off on premises and switching on the cloud, but you have many more different things you need to do. And at the end of the day, you also need solid technical delivery team who could do things for you. So because you can draw something on the whiteboard and define something in pen and paper, but at the end of the day, you need a team of people who are technically capable to do that, right? So that capability is required, which helps you define and design that migration strategy. So these are the things we expect that you will have before you really start planning about any migration, right? Now we'll talk about challenges, typical enterprise challenges, which enable you to actually go down the path and then help you define things in different ways. So we'll talk about legacy applications. So when you have an enterprise running applications for 10, 15 years, you have many different legacy applications that could be a desktop based or web based or console application. You have licensed application purchase for a typical domain specific activity, which runs on a cluster with a specific setup, requires a hardware, a MAC address to activate those things. So they are very dependent on the hardware or the device they work, and that's how it is licensed. And that's how it used to be in 15 years ago, how application companies used to build their application. You have custom application created by the company itself, by a set of developers either hired for the application or was part of that organization. And then you have like WCF and Windows services, which basically runs on the device to help you do certain, let's say, timer job or some connectivity back into outside, and then exposing some application endpoint to the external world outside of the machine without letting anybody to connect to that machine. So there are these legacy footprints or technical debt we sometimes call available today when you start analyzing the application landscape. So you do the first thing you do, which is application assessment, right? So that's what means like what do you really have today? Either you have it documented or you have might have something like which is absolutely not there. So how do you explore those things? So there are tools available to help you explore, get you the data. If you are having a support team who are supporting those applications, you might have a predefined, well-documented set up things regarding the dependencies, the runtime, how to set it up, how to fix some issues, how to configure certain things in a different way, etc. So those are the kind of documentation and the things we expect that you do a little bit of background work. And there are a lot of challenges with that, because not always you will have answer to every question, right? So you have to figure it out the way how to get them. I don't know a single bullet, silver bullet to solve all the problems, but these are the problems we have seen in past. How you don't have enough information, even if you know the right set of questions, you still do not have the answer to all your questions. So you need to bring in more and more people into the conversation, maybe an application developed by someone who left the company, and then that source code is no more managed and probably lost, right? So how do you get into those kind of application and figure out on your own, right, by whatever access you have to make it running in the cloud, right? So these are the challenges we have seen a lot of time, and you all will agree to that, right? Because this is something which is not very uncommon. Now, in terms of legacy platform components, right, we talked about application, but the platform also could be legacy, right? You may have an operating system, which is a pretty old one out of support. You may have a legacy database, which is no more supported by the vendor, database vendor. The runtime could be very old because the application was developed 15 years ago. So I have seen companies running application using .NET 1.1, which probably is now for 20 plus years old, right? So, but still they are running, working without any trouble. So why to change? So probably that's the reason nobody changed that, right? And any change in an enterprise requires money, budget, and approval, right? So that's why it's not about somebody's wish to change it. It's about the business decision. So if things are not working, then it needs to have a fix immediately. If things are working, why to bother about it, right? So and this legacy continues. His legacy continues with Windows Server Active Directory, that is the legacy IAM system, Windows authentication being used in many different connectivity, like LDAP queries are being heavily used in the application for authentication. You have a SAN storage for storing the file share, creating a file share, etc. You have a DMZ, so all these things are pretty much present even today on. So in the modern cloud, these things works a bit differently, and we'll talk about the solution as well. But I want to highlight these challenges just to make sure that we kind of cover the common area of challenges. Now, in terms of solutions, right, there are a couple of things we need to really start thinking from the design level. Now, what I am going to talk about is everything at the design level, right? Because a lot of things you have to predict, think, put it in the paper before you really start working on it. First and foremost is the industry and the compliance, because that's very important. If you're working in a banking industry or a healthcare industry, you need to follow certain guideline and principle, especially when you move into cloud, because you don't own the infrastructure. A lot of responsibility belongs to the vendor who provides that cloud infrastructure. So you need to, how do you ensure that your industry specific compliance is taken care by the vendor? That happens through a third party audit, and we call it as compliance. So all the cloud provider available today provides you the compliance certification, like SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, um, a HIPAA compliance, FedMap compliance. All those different compliances are available with every cloud vendor, just to make sure that, because you don't own and control those infrastructure, you also, not just from an application perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective, you have that covered, right? And then information security. Security is the key in cloud, right? You cannot really deny that. It's like having a door in your house, right? So you must have a door in your house, no matter how solid that house is. If you do not have a door, it is not protected, right? So you need to have a protection. So that's because your customer data is with you, your data is important. You may have something which is very internal and you want to protect from unauthorized access. So all these things, important thing is the security. And again, when you move to cloud, because you don't own the data center, there are a lot of things you need to look for from a compliance perspective. So that's the information sec. We'll have a set of guidelines, checklist, etc., which you need to really comply and to be able to proceed further. If you bypass that discussion, you'll have to come back and do that again. Probably you have to change the whole architecture because you have missed a major component within that guideline, right? So it has to be from the day zero as part of your discussion and the design, and you need to have a constant review of what you are trying to achieve with the information security team within the organization. And it's a seamless collaboration, as you can imagine that you don't really have the full knowledge and capability within a single team dealing with the IT part of the story. You have a business need. That's a business architect will come into play and help you define that. You have an architecture which who generally follows the company standard and then implement only the standard guideline defined over a period of time and goes through continuous review. Ops team, what happens when an application is deployed and used in production? You need an ops, continuous ops, who will make sure that application is seamlessly available to all the end user. If things go wrong, it needs to be fixed. If there is a change request coming in, that needs to be implemented. So you need to bring all of them into this initial discussion to see how each of them has to really play a key critical role into this whole design phase. So that's very, very important. You cannot go on your own. When I say on your own, that doesn't mean that by yourself. It means that on your own team, only the IT or the developer or the infrastructure team cannot do a single migration. It has to have a different input from different people from the beginning. And landing zone. So landing zone, you think of it like a stadium, right? So it's you are going to play a match. You don't start building the stadium on the day of the match, right? So the stadium has to be prepared well before the match. You can use that same stadium for different matches in different days, but you have to have that ready. Cloud landing zone is something which is like that. So you basically build that whole thing where you start deploying the application. There are magnitude of benefits by for doing that approach. One is that you are taking all the precautions of your industry, compliance, the guideline, etc. And you are not really bothering the application team to really think about how to do that, right? So they only focus on their own application, get a place, and then start doing it. It's like checking into the hotel and then checking it out from the hotel, right? You don't really need to worry about from where they get a food supply, how they change the carton, or what is the source of electricity, how they pay the monthly bill of the electricity, etc. You don't really need to think about that, right? So you essentially are basically taken away from those responsibilities, which is sort of like a central responsibility at the end of the day. Backup and DL for every application and data, backup is must, and it is there, right? So you need to carry that same legacy backup mechanism in a different way. So start thinking about backup as a service. Every cloud vendor today provides backup as a service. So you really don't have to carry the server, dedicated server to take your backup, right? So it used to be like that on premises. People used to maintain a server with a backup solution deployed over there, and you keep taking the backup. Um, Offsite DR is pretty easy. So you say that I have a deployment today in the region one, and I need a disaster recovery in region two. So if you do that, you basically are trying to create a replica of the same application infrastructure through probably a DevOps. So you do that as part of your design, that you need to have that criteria available. You do not migrate an existing disaster recovery solution, because disaster recovery on premises is totally different from the disaster recovery in the cloud. Sometimes the on premises disaster recovery is active most of the time, because you need to have the hardware ready, and in the cloud you can do it on demand, which means if the site goes down, another site comes up, you will have enough time to really deploy things. So it totally depends on the RTO and RPO numbers, which is defined by the business, that this is the downtime we can accept. So if it is significant amount of longer downtime, you can afford to have a fresh deployment in a different region during a region failure, right? So let's say you have a deployment in one of the Europe regions, and that whole region is down due to some reason. Then you will be able to deploy it in the US region where it is up and running, the cloud is up and running, by enabling your DevOps to be able to deploy in another location, right? So that's something you can think about. High availability and scalability is something which is part and parcel of any business critical application. So any application which is a key critical business component has got a transaction involved, data involved. People are really not using something old. You can consider that. HA in the cloud concept is generally few clicks. So you will be able to perform things like your your application, etc., having to have an HA capability just by enabling them. So you do not need a lot of setting as such. You can scale your application horizontally, which means that if you have a server size or a service size, you can increase the capacity. So we call it as a vertical scalability. So you increase the same box by adding more RAMs, more CPU, more storage, or you can create a distributed application which basically getting copies of the application in multiple different boxes. So we call it as horizontal scalability. So horizontal scalability requires a distributed kind of application architecture. If your application is a more legacy single application kind of thing, monolith, then you probably think about vertical. But if you have a web-based solution, which is a distributed application, you probably think about the horizontal scaling. So depending on how that application is architected and developed, you choose the right scalability. And scalability, again, is just a slider in the cloud. So you just need to say, I need to increase by X, and you get it increased by X in few minutes. That's all, right? You don't have to buy additional hardware to do that. Performance or on demand. So even the scalability can be automated, which means that you know that you need to increase during the month of December because there is a lot of sales happening in this e-commerce portal. So you go ahead and increase that. But you can also say that I will not do that if there is a spike in usage. Even in the month of November during the Black Friday sales, I will still increase that. So you basically can choose what kind of scalability, auto scalability it might happen. From database cluster to a PaaS-based solution is something which is always recommended because database is a big headache for anything. First of all, it is the heart of the system. If it goes down, everything goes down. So you need to make sure that heart is up and running. And also at the same time, you have a copy of that heart. So if one heart goes down, you have another heart. So database is like the heart of the system. So to implement something like that, you need a lot of expertise and people, manpower, availability, and 24 by 7, 365 days kind of monitoring, right? So which is additional cost. What I'm saying is that it is how people used to manage database till today before cloud, but now it is all by cloud. So if you choose to go with the platform as a service model, where it will be ensured by SLA for you to define the redundancy, etc., it will be taken care by the automation. So you don't have to do anything, right? And no DV activity required, so which means that you can actually save a lot of development cost and probably reinvest those savings into your skill set, which is required to make it faster. There are a lot of scenario on premises where scripts and scheduled tasks are basically running in dedicated virtual machines. We sometimes call them as management virtual machine or automation virtual machine. In those machines, you basically do those things. If they are not typically an application, but they are basically to do something which is sort of like a script job, right? You don't need them. There are many different ways to do those things. So in cloud, you have a serverless way of doing it. So you can run a small piece of code in a serverless way. You don't even need to deploy it in a dedicated PaaS mode. You can have a consumption base. So whenever that trigger kicks in, it uses a certain capacity for a certain period of time, and then it goes down, right? So there is always a cost benefit of using those kind of mechanisms. So there are ways like automation, container, DevOps, etc., through which you can create certain activities. And the most important thing is that while you are trying to do all this, you are basically trying to connect to many different services internally, and you might be providing secrets. sometime in form of certificate, sometime is in form of username and password. You must consider putting them into key store, right? Use the cloud native key management solution, KMS solution, which helps you restrict the access and prevents you from accidentally expose those data to the end user, right? You must consider that. And in every cloud, we have a KMS solution available. So you must look at those KMS solution for anything which is a username and password kind of thing. VM sizes. Now, in the on-premises, what I have seen is the virtual machines are having certain sizes. It be possible that you might not get an exact size. However, it's a good time for you to rethink and optimize those virtual machine sizes. By saying so, what I mean is that the virtual machines are sometimes over provisioned. You can reduce the size. You can even increase the virtual machine size if they are, let's say, 100% utilized, just to have a buffer for your application. So it's an opportunity for you to optimize the virtual machine usage, which could be a reduction in the size and capacity to increasing the size and capacity. So you don't have to have a one-on-one mapping between the on-premises and the cloud. So you have to really rethink in this thing, right? And what is the purpose of the virtual machine? Is it to store the data? Is it to do a lot of transactional activity, IOPS? Is it to have a memory intensive thing like SAP HANA? Choose the right kind of virtual machine family for right kind of activity. If you're doing a data science activity, which requires image analysis, which is sort of like a memory intensive activity and requires a GPU support, you have a different series of virtual machine to do that. They are called as specialized virtual machines, right? NVIDIA graphics, etc. And then you have a normal application running in a typical core, multi-core environment. You have a different kind of virtual machine. So you should not select everything like a generalized virtual machine or everything like a high configured virtual machine. That will not neither give you the optimal performance nor give you the cost saving, right? Cloud is all about economics, right? So it is a cost saving activity at the end of the day. You will be asked to do that. And storage servers. We don't need a virtual machine based file share, which means that you can use the native pass as your file share, dump any and every file into a blob storage kind of storage, and then access it from your application, virtual machine, etc. This is a cost effective and high performance, highly available, scalable, and unlimited. Okay, so it doesn't depend on the hardware and virtual machine. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Monitoring is something absolutely important because incident will happen and can happen. And when an incident happens, people will come and dig into the historical data. If you do not have a monitoring as part of your design, you will be punished. And when you design something, your monitoring should be part of the agenda, uh, a checklist which you must sign and agree on, right? And there are different monitoring tools available for different solutions. There could be a dedicated monitoring tool for an application code, and a monitoring tool for your cluster, monitoring tool for database. How do you bring all the data together in a single pane of view? You need to design that. You need to have alerts and notifications with automation. So, which means that it gives you an opportunity to also think about how network segmentation happens. Are you out of network space in your on-premises? Maybe this is the time to increase the IP range. So create separate subnets for separate activities, or not one subnet for everything in the application. So do those designing while doing the migration. You don't have to do one-on-one. Network, which is on premises versus which is software driven network in the cloud, is completely different. So they act and behave differently. So you should leverage those capabilities natively. Hub and spoke model, which allows you to increase. So if you're out of the network IP range, you can always connect to another and build up another thing. And if you go by the hub and spoke model, it becomes easier for you to do that. Web application firewall, WAP, or load balancing are the key components which generally is part of your solution needs to be natively moved. So consider a native firewall instead of having a firewall installed in a virtual machine like Barracuda. Use native load balancer like cloud load balancer, etc., which gets created for you by default automatically, and they give you all sort of layer 7 load balancing capability, right? And it has got all the also TLS termination and all this thing, SSL termination. And it is sometimes not so easy to replace the existing load balancing and firewall solution for certain reason. And if you happen to have that kind of thing and you don't find an alternate and then the exact same requirement available in the cloud, probably you have to continue to use the same solution. But that doesn't mean that you should not look for an opportunity to come out of that mode and do something which is native. Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS, which is commonly known, generally is minimum 4 server deployment. If it is so, then you have to maintain 4 virtual machines with redundancy, that means +4, and with a zone deployment, that's a DR, then +8, 16 servers unnecessary. Do you really need that? Can you replace it with a modern cloud single sign-on mechanism? For example, in Azure Active Directory, you have a single sign-on, so you just need to enable that and start using it. By doing so, you might need to change the applications which are being used by the which are getting used for ADFS. So ADFS has got an entry for an application which is being configured in the app config. You might need to change them if you change the configuration here. So that is something throughout the whole range and spectrum of application you might be using needs to change. If you have a login gateway created, which is a single gateway for all application, maybe that gateway configuration is required to be changed, but all the application will only point to the gateway depending on how that design looks like, right? You might need to think about it. Think about the VPN, right? VPN is sometimes absolutely important in an enterprise scenario, and that can be replaced with Azure like Azure Bastion, point to site connectivity, etc. However, you need to do an early evaluation. That means how much of it is required. Can you maintain the, let's say, express route? If it's already there, you don't need a VPN, it's already connected, right? So do you need a virtual desktop connectivity for your remote employees? If so, then they might also need a VPN solution. So you need to really think about your existing VPN solution. Management server, I briefly touched about it in the automation, right, where it basically scripts, but here I'm talking about the backup, SAN, switch management, etc. So you generally do not need those dedicated virtual machine doing these activities. You can use a simple Windows VM in Azure, 10 VM in Azure, which basically will help you run those certain tools you might need to run in a desktop mode to perform some management activity, like collecting the data, copying something, and do all those things. I'm not sure how that look like, but you might need to use a VM, and that should be enough, right? Most of the time, use automation to the management. For example, the virtual machine needs to be shut down in the non-production environment every day at 8 p.m. If that is the policy, you can use automation to do that. And automation will kickstart at 8 p.m., whatever time zone you have selected, and delete, shut down, deallocate all the virtual machines in that region. So, which means that you can save a lot of cost. You're not running the virtual machine till the next day 8 a.m. That is 12 hours straight away. You're not paying to your vendor for the usage. So it's like switching off your electricity while you are sleeping or outside of your home, right? So you can do those things through automation, and it was not present in the on-premises. So there is no direct comparison of that kind of cost saving, but it is something which is to be done in the cloud. With this, I thank you for all your attention. And I know there are a lot of things which you encounter every day while trying to do this migration. But these are the key things I thought will be helpful for you to really take back and then discuss and think through how you probably implement something which is very cloud specific. So wish you all the best for your cloud journey. Thank you very much again. Have a great day.